Well, good morning. This is the last week for the series on science and religion. Can they coexist? The God factor. And so this week we're going to be looking at the origins of humanity. We've looked at the origins of the universe, the origins of the planet, life on the planet. Today we're going to wrestle with the origins of humanity. Keep in mind, what's my disclaimer? You guys should know it. This is the third week. What's my disclaimer? Matt is not a... There you go. Matt does not have all the answers. There you go. Yeah, you guys are doing good already. So just to keep those things in mind, and I'm really trying to pack a lot into a very short period of time. So keep that in mind. So today, origins of humanity. We saw one of the things that has really happened in this field of science is this idea of evolution. And so evolution came about when, this theory of evolution came about when Charles Darwin wrote the book, The Origin of Species, back in 1859. And he wrote that book, and that caused some stir within the community and within the culture, and yet there were mixed reactions from the religious community at that time. We find theologians and pastors all over the map on the reaction of that. The other thing that happened in the idea of evolution, I think what really stirred things up, was when in 1925, John Scopes was a teacher in Tennessee. And at that time, it was unlawful to teach evolution in the public school system there in Tennessee, and he broke that law and taught evolution in the classroom. And then that created the Scopes trial. You may remember the Scopes, you probably don't remember the Scopes trial, but you remember hearing about the Scopes trial. And so there's the Scopes trial that happened. And since then, it seems as though there's been a really lively debate between creationists and creation and evolution, and these two ideas that have been competing for the hearts of America since then. And you can actually see that lived out on our cars, if you've noticed. You noticed when you drive around, Larry, can we pull up the image of what we see on people's cars, the bumper car, the bumpers, the back of our trunks? No, the other image with the fish symbol, There you go. How many people have seen one of those fish symbols on the back of a car? Some of you may have that, right? That started out, that's the sign of the early Christian church, the idea of fish. And that was a symbol. The early Christians were fishermen and fishing communities, and so this in the early church. And then, so somebody in the evolution side of the debate thought it would be really cute to put some legs on the fish and put Darwin in there. And so instead of Jesus, it's now Darwin, and the Darwin fish is, so you see that. So then a Christian or a creationist came along and said, well, we can't have the Darwin fish out there, so let's create a truth fish to eat the Darwin fish, right? And so that has happened. And then I found this other one. I'm not really sure what it is, but it's got a fish holding a tool now, and it says evolve. And so I think it seems to me, I took it as a comment on the debate, grow up, kind of evolve. And so I actually found another one of a dinosaur eating a fish that goes on the back of your car. So there's all kinds of things, but it's interesting because even within our culture, this debate still lives, doesn't it? And this is still going on, and this has been something that's really been tough for people to get our minds around. So I want to share a little bit about evolution and then look at the Genesis chapter we read this morning. So first on the evolutionary side, from the scientific point of view. It's interesting to note, I just want to note that Darwin, in his book, Origin of the Species, nowhere mentions the word evolution in his book. The word evolution is not used. Now, it doesn't mean that that's not what's talked about or intended there, but it's later science that comes and puts this word evolution and evolution theory together. In fact, Darwin, when he wrote his book, The Origin of the Species, 104 times within his book, he mentions create, creator, or creation. See, Darwin actually believed in God, and what he was uncovering was just how God made life change over time as he observed the world. And so he was attributing it to a creator. He was not taking a creator out of that. And so it's interesting to kind of remember that Darwin probably was not a theist, and I won't go into that, but he was a deist. He believed in a creator. He believed that God created these things and these animals and these plants. And he was just observing and uncovering what God had been revealing to him. So that's it. So a couple things to understand about evolution to make clear. One is that evolution is simply the idea that species life changes over time. It evolves over time. That's a simple definition of evolutionary theory. It is not talking about how we go from non-life to life. A lot of people sometimes assume that that's part of the theory. It's not. It's only the idea that there is change over time within life, within the organic world. It's not about how life came about. It's only to show and observe how change happens. And the other thing about evolutionary theory is that it's not about direct descent. Darwin actually talked about a tree of life and how this tree had many branches and arms. And I think one of the most misleading images that we see in textbooks is this image that Larry had up earlier of evolution that we always attribute to evolution. The one with the ape and the going to the human being, you know that one? That one, there you go. So we look at that and we get the impression from that image, and how many people have seen an image similar to this or seen this image somewhere, right? So what I get, the conclusion I draw from that is my grandfather's an ape. My grandfather is a chimpanzee, right? So there's this idea that I directly descended from an animal. When in evolutionary theory, that's not necessarily the case. What evolutionary theory says is that the ape and the next species in the planet, they shared a common ancestor. That there was a common ancestor that came before those two, and one branch went one way and one branch went the other way. And so that these different animals, we all share common ancestry with some other earlier form in the evolutionary process. We're not direct descendants from chimpanzees or apes, but our DNA to the chimpanzee and human DNA is very, very close together. Very small margin of difference. And yet one species becomes chimpanzees, and the evolution would say another species became Homo sapiens, or who we are. The other thing is that there is this idea, what evolution has shown pretty clearly, the fossil record shows, studies have shown, science shows pretty clearly, is that change does happen over short periods of time. Even within 20 or 40-year periods of time, we can see a new species actually emerge from another species. So this has been observed and documented. We also see in the fossil record that there is change over time in species. And so in small ways, we can see that evolution does bear out. And there's a lot of research to show that, a lot of science that shows that those small changes do happen. What is part of the debate is, do the big changes happen? Science is not able to really say that the big changes happen. And when we say big changes, we're talking about how do we get from reptiles to birds or from birds to mammals. So the big leaps. And there are gaps in that understanding. There's not scientific evidence yet that fills in those gaps. And so there's still a lot of question about how that happened. And so evolution is starting to touch on some things that are true and our evidence shows is true, but hasn't quite captured all of the story, all of how we got here, all of human life. And so there are gaps even within that theory. So we have to keep that in mind. And so an example, for example, of small changes that lead to changes in a species would be, how many people have ever heard of a Labradoodle? Right? So what has happened is that we've taken two breeds and we've crossbred those breeds within a species, and we've created a new breed. And so there's been change within that species. And so we can see that readily. That happens. And so what evolution says is that could happen if a lot of small changes over longer periods of time could potentially be a big change, could it not? And so that's the proposal. That's the theory. Part of what Darwin didn't know about, was he didn't know about cells at the time he wrote the book. He also didn't know about DNA. And so DNA is a whole nother world within the evolutionary process. And so DNA does play a factor in the changes, in those small changes, because DNA acts, these codes that are in our DNA, they go together and then they create chains of codes, and that creates a lot of random codes, And I know that I'm not going to bore you with how that works, but it's kind of like these Legos. These two codes tell certain amino acids to build proteins and so forth, which are the building blocks of life. So these codes tell or map out what's to be built or what's to be created, just like these Legos, right? So I can put these Legos together, all kinds of random patterns, and we could build a castle with it, right? How many people ever played with Legos? You know, what's cool about Legos is you can take them apart and you can build a helicopter, you can take them apart again and you can build a castle, and you take them apart again and you can build a little house with a car and a garage into it, right? So all the guys are with me, right? You know, I know you know the Legos, right? The interesting thing is, so there's all this random things that can happen, right? And different ways that we can put all these chains together. At the same time, it's really constrained, isn't it? Because I can only put these blocks together a certain way. I can't stick them together this way. I can only put them together a certain way. It's almost as though they're designed to go together a particular way. It's almost as though they're intended. There's a design behind the building blocks of life. And so this idea is, and think about this, DNA is not so much a map of how to be, you know, a lot of people think it's a blueprint of how to build something. It's more like a library. It's like a library full of information to create you and I. They say that it's greater, there's more information and greater complexity in the DNA code than there is in any software program we've created. It's massive, it's complex, it is so overwhelming amount of information. You and I have enough DNA in our bodies that if we were to stretch it out, it would go from the earth to the moon and back 8,000 times. That's a whole lot of information, isn't it? That goes into creating, building you and me. And that's within us. That is all there within us in a very microscopic level, working and happening all the time. The interesting thing also is that what happens when you have a random process, there are things called mutations. Do you know that you're a mutant? You've probably seen, X-Men or all those movies about mutations and everything. Well, each one of us here today we're mutants. We all have mutations in us that nobody else has. So you have 100 mutations in you, in your genetic code, that I don't have. I've got 100 genetic mutations that you don't have. We all have these mutations within us. And it's this idea that those mutations, over time, actually create changes. And that's the concept. Interestingly enough, though, as much as random as this DNA code is, it also seems to be finely tuned to create us. And let me show you, and I'm going to try and keep this very simple. Larry, can you pull up the graph from the Journal of Molecular Evolution? This is coming from Science Side. This isn't coming from and I don't fully comprehend this. I can't explain it all to you. Particularly, I've read the chapter and I've read the research, but it's complex. But basically, what's happening here is that they took all the genetic codes, the universal codes, the genetic codes for life, and they put it into a computer program, and these are all the potential random codes for life, and they put them, and they said how many of these random codes could produce life, and these are just the codes that could potentially create life. Does that make sense? There are actually there are trillions and trillions of possibilities. So this is a very small look at just the codes that they think would actually create you and me, or create life, universal code for life, all right? And if you look at that, has anybody ever seen this shape before on a graph? Any mathematicians here? Anybody that's done scientific research, right? This is affectionately known as the bell-shaped curve in research, right? Statistics. Now, where would one anticipate the code for life for you and me to exist to be on this graph? Where would you expect it to be from a scientific point of view? Where do we say, when we look at a bell curve, where do we say most of the scientific credibility is in the bell curve? In the center, right? So we would expect to find the universal code for life somewhere in the middle of that graph, somewhere in that pile of random codes. If you see the arrow off to the left, that's where the code is. The code is outside the bell curve. The code actually for life is about 1 in a million chance. 1 in a million. The point being is that of all the codes that could potentially create life here on this planet for you and me, is that you and I are 1 in a million. Our code, 1 in a million. Which is amazing to me. And I keep coming back to this point as I have been looking at all this. I keep coming back to this point that it's like we're supposed to be here. It's like somebody wanted us here. There are just too many things that could have gone wrong, too many possibilities that could have gone awry that say that we shouldn't be here, that we should not exist, and yet we do. And so we're here. And even science is beginning to reveal to us that this is what's going on. Now, the other side of the debate is this idea of Genesis. And if you remember from the last 2 weeks, we talked about there's a difference between the field of science in that science gives us the how, and that the Scripture and that faith and religion gives us the who and the why, or for what purpose. And really, when we look at Genesis chapter and Genesis chapter 2, which we look at about the creation of Adam and Eve, is not so much about how Adam and Eve were created. It's more about who created Adam and Eve, and it's also about what's the purpose for the creation of humanity. So a few things I just want to raise up out of that Genesis text this morning. Because because it's actually building upon chapter 1. I don't see the chapter 1 and chapter 2 as different stories of creation. I see chapter 2 as a continuation, as a focusing in of the story of creation. We got the big picture in chapter 1. Now we're zooming in again specifically at humanity in chapter 2. And really, chapter 2 is really all about chapter 3, if you go back and read it. What happens in chapter 3? Anybody remember from Sunday school class what happens in chapter 3? What happens in chapter 3? There's a tree right? And what are they not supposed to do? Eat from the tree? Chapter 3 is about the fall of humanity. Chapter 2 is really setting up the context for what happens there. So a few things to take from chapter 2 are that one thing is that God created you and I, human beings, to be in a special relationship with God. We're different than all other parts of creation. It is the humans that are to be in relationship with God, in a certain relationship with God that God has created. And that's the idea, the symbolism behind the garden, that the garden is this place of special relationship with God. The other thing about this chapter is that God created us actually with a divine purpose. That you and I were created for a reason. And that God wanted to create life, but that also you and I have a purpose within that life. It's interesting because if you heard this morning the text read, it talked about this idea that we were created and God put Adam in the garden to tend and care for it. That you and I were created to be responsible for God's creation. We were the caretakers of God's creation. It's interesting also that you can also translate that Hebrew a little bit differently. There's some other ways to translate it, which also means that we're to worship God, that we were created to worship God. And so there's also that understanding even also within the text, that you and I were created to care for the earth and also to worship, to be in relationship with our Creator. And the other thing about chapter 2 is a lot of what's happening in chapter 2 is really about setting up what's going to happen in chapter 3, as I said. You know, the shrubs of the field, there's no shrub of the field, no plants of the field. What happens after the fall? Those shrubs and those plants have thorns and thistles on them. There was no one to tend the ground in chapter 2. What happens after the fall? Adam has to go and work and toil and sweat to till the ground and make it produce these things, whereas previously God was making those things produce. And so all those things that you see mentioned A lot of what we see mentioned in chapter 2 actually is referred to again in chapter 3 after the fall. And so that's the idea behind it, that we're created to be in special relationship with God. So how do you put those two things, how do you put evolution of the how and the who together? Well, here's what's helped me, and I'm just going to share what's helped me. Who here can tell me who created the automobile, the gas-powered automobile? Anybody want to take a guess at that one? It's actually it's complicated. You've already heard you have the. What's that? Yes. You said the German, right? Actually, the first patent in Germany for the automobile was Carl Benz, I believe. So you're right. You got Germany, right? But there's also debate who was first, right? Who in America do we attribute the creation of the automobile to? Henry Ford. Remember that guy, right? Henry Ford? What made Henry Ford popular was not only did he create the Model T, but he also created a process by which the Model T was created, right? He created this process to mass produce the Model T, and that's what made him rich. Now, how many people drove a Model T Ford to church today? Anybody? Nobody? Nobody drove a Model T? How many people drove a 57 Chevy? Anybody drive a 57? Anybody drive a hybrid to church today? Okay, we got to talk about stewardship again, right? We have to talk about the global warming. Do we need to go there? So how many people have seen a hybrid car? Ah, there we go. All right. So how do we get from the Model T to the Toyota Prius, the hybrid car? What happened over that period of time, right? It's been a little over 100 years. And we see what happened was we saw small changes over time that led to the automobile. So the automobile has evolved. Here's my point, though. Do we say because we can look at the process of the evolution of the car that there's no inventor or creator of it? Just because we can identify the process, just because we can say this is the process, do we also say there's no creator then anymore? We don't need a Henry Ford? That we don't need a Carl Benz? It's actually, there is an inventor. There is a creator. There's someone who designed the process. There's someone who designed the automobile. There's someone who created you and me. There's someone who will have created that process for life to change. And it's God. So to help us unpack that a little bit further this morning, each week I've had a different guest interview this week, and I'm actually pleased to have come up this morning Don Poole. He shares the last name with me because he's my father, and I'm going to invite him to come up. He's a biology teacher. He taught Montgomery County, and he taught the International Baccalaureate program at Richard Montgomery, and which was the gifted and talented program that was compared internationally on that, and taught biology and science. So going out into the world with Dad was always a science lesson. So I have to give him partial credit for this sermon series, don't I? Because my interest in science and my interest in God really is from a man who studied science and also was always saying there's a God involved. And that's what I appreciate about growing up with my dad, is that there was the science, but there was also and this is God. This is where I see God in the science. This is where I see God in creation. This is where I see God in all this. And so that's part of the inspiration. My dad is also, we were talking the other day, he's actually much more well-read on this subject than I am. I'm about half a dozen to a dozen books in on the subject. We counted them up. There are about 50 books that he's read on this, that are out there about this subject that he's read and been involved with. That's just the beginning. That's just the beginning. So, and one day he's going to write a book. He keeps telling me.
I keep saying it, right.
So maybe we'll see that one day.
Right.
So you taught evolution in the classroom.
Yes.
You were a teacher. You taught evolution.
Yeah.
And I know that you taught Sunday school on Sundays. I saw that. I was dragged kicking and screaming.
Yep, you sure were.
So we went to Sunday
Yes, you
school,
did.
and you would teach, Genesis and the Bible on
Right.
Sunday, and then in the classroom during the week you're teaching evolution.
Right.
So how did that? Did that create a conflict for you, or was that easy to do, conflicting, or how did you navigate that?
Well, at first it was a conflict because I was taught science and I was taught the Bible. And I was brought up in a Christian home as he was. And, of course, I didn't become a Christian until I was well in my 20s. But most important thing I learned was that the Bible's not a science book. You don't want to use them for the same purpose. The Bible is for faith. It's for relationship with God. Science is about a repeatable phenomenon. When we look at the world around us, we have to look at how can we find these repeatable things that are going on, and then what conclusions can we draw about from those things. That's science. And then science tries to guess or tries to conclude what happened in the history of the world, what happened in the history of the universe, what makes sense, how can we extrapolate the information backward into time. And this is why science has come up with the idea of evolution. It's the only thing that makes sense of the data that we see when we look at the entire world around us and all the diversity of life that exists. And second of all, I learned early in my career that not everybody thinks the way I think. And I remember as a young teacher being at a back-to-school night. You remember those? And I'm going over my curriculum, and right in the middle of the presentation, this parent stands up and says, "Mr. Poole, you taught about the beginning of life, and you didn't mention God." And I was like, "Whoa." Well, I was taught, mention God in the classroom because then you get into debates and people's feelings get hurt. So I just, but at the time I wasn't a Christian anyway. But I was very disturbed by that comment. And that set me on a life journey to discover the relationships between God and the science that I was teaching.
And that'll be the book that you're going to write.
Right, yes,
Good.
yes.
So do you think that we should try and make Genesis fit evolution? I mean, should we be trying to do that? Are there ways to do that? Or should we take them both together? Is it either or? Is it a both and? What do you think?
It's both. It's a theory of evolution is science and needs to remain in science. It's in this realm of science. It's how we're learning to describe the creation. We're learning the process by which God created. To limit God to being, he only did it this way in 7 days on 24-hour periods wait a minute. God couldn't do it another way? He's God. He does what he wants, But the thing that I'm learning more and more is the Bible shows that it was not by chance, that it was God that did all this. And science is showing more and more. As you read more and more about science, you're going to learn that there's more and more purpose involved in everything we're studying than we thought. A lot of atheist scientists like to say it's all by chance. We're just a collection of atoms and molecules, that's all. But that's not true. As Matt showed from the graph, and as you see, we are not here by chance. It couldn't be by chance. So the universe is intelligent. Where did that come from?
So is there anything in the field of science that, and maybe you just started to allude to that, is what is it in the field of science that says that there's, in human life that says there's a creator or there is a God?
Well, there are two things that I could explain. I could go on for a couple hours.
I know you could.
But there's just two things I think are really significant. Number one is something. Any Star Trek fans? Okay.
All right.
What is the one thing they're always concerned about when they find a new life? Is it sentient? Right? Okay, that's the key to us. We are sentient beings. We're beings that are self-aware and conscious. We're beings that worship. There's no other creator. There's nothing in this world that does what we do. Nothing. I have a kind of the vision of this. If you look at what we are, all of a sudden, all of these creatures that have been formed on the earth, and now one that can give back praise to God, to a creator. No other animal does that. No other animal even thinks about that we know of. We're unique. We are unique. And one of the things that scientists tend to do is downplay our uniqueness. Oh, we're just another animal. We are unique. We are exceptional as an organism. Okay? And the second thing is the universe is finely tuned for us. Do you know that there are at least 15 physical constants that if they were changed even very, very, very slightly, we wouldn't be here? We wouldn't be here. We're unique.
So what would you say, the last question, and I've been asking each person each week, is what would you say to a person who may be thinking evolution is the answer? You've already alluded to that a little bit. So there's not a need for a creator, or that the creator is irrelevant. God is irrelevant. Because we have evolution, or someone who may be struggling to put those pieces together. What would you say to a person who might be struggling with that?
Well, first of all, they are in separate camps. The Bible is about how we relate to the Creator. It's a history lesson, and it's a spiritual lesson of how we form our relationship and continue our relationship with the Creator. That's what the Bible's all about. It's not about how the Creator did anything. Okay? I'd like to quote in Genesis 1, go back to chapter 1. Verses 11 and 24 have both of them have a similar phrase. In there it says, God said, let the land produce. In both those phrases, let the land produce plants is one phrase, and then let the land produce animals is the other phrase. Now, way back in the early history of the church, St. Augustine, remember, you've heard of him, St. Augustine said that let the land produce meant that God put into the earth, had embedded into the earth and into the creatures their ability to evolve, their ability to come about. Okay? So the Bible shows some very important conclusions about what science is learning. But you don't see any of the details. That's what science is all about. So I have just end on a few questions, which is what I did when I taught. Okay? How do you explain this intelligence and the evolution of life without God in the Bible? Okay? How do you learn about the journey of our relationship without the Bible? And how do you explain the existence of that idea that there is a creator?
Amen.
That's all I have to say. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you.
Okay,
yes.
You're welcome.
Thank you. We'll see you at 9:30. All right.
Okay, I'll be back.
So I grew up. This is great. Isn't this great to have some of this information? You can see where, kind of where I get some of this, honestly, right? And there were times in my life where I just wanted to, I grew up in the generation where you actually got spanked, and I would always say, I wish he would just spank me, then lecture me, because that spanking would have been over like that, but the lecture lasted 30 minutes, so, that was a part of that. I just want to end today, and I want to end the series on this quote, actually from a geneticist. His name is Dennis Alexander. He wrote a book called Creation or Evolution, Do We Have to Choose? But here's a quote I pulled from his book, which I think sums everything up. He said, science is a holy enterprise because it involves uncovering the wonders of God's creation. Let's keep it that way. Amen.
Well, I think we just saw